Once again, welcome to this all advisory body briefing on Special Project 2, Decision Making for Stronger Fishing Communities. My name is Gilly Lyons with Council staff, and I am joined today by Melissa Arend and Karma Norman of Northern Economics. Melissa and Karma will be presenting their work to date on a draft methodology for evaluating the resilience of West Coast fishing communities as part of a community resilience decision support framework being developed under Council Special Project 2. Special Project 2 is one of 3 projects for which the Council has received dedicated funding through the Inflation Reduction Act and will be a topic on the Council's agenda at its upcoming meeting in Spokane starting next week. Melissa and Karma will go into more detail about the project's objectives and components, but I'll just say real quick that its overarching goal is to develop a decision support framework that will assist the Council in evaluating how its management actions and recommendations affect the resilience of fishing-dependent and fishing-engaged communities. And perhaps I'll stop there and turn things over to Melissa and Karma, and I will also stop sharing my screen so that they can share their screen.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gilly. Hold on one second while I move things around. All right, how does that look?
Fantastic.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining us here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa Arend. I'm an economist at Northern Economics, and I'm joined here today by my co-author and colleague on this work, Dr. Karma Norman. And together, we're going to be giving an overview of our summary of progress and our draft methodology for the Community Resilience Decision Tool project. So the motivation for this project really comes from the fact that there's a growing recognition about the number and complexity of various stressors that are affecting fishing communities on the West Coast, from climate change and changing stock distributions to new ocean use pressures such as offshore wind development, as well as pronounced recognition of economic challenges such as market disruptions and rising costs associated with inflation. And of course, all of these, what we typically think of external stressors to fishery management decisions, do combine and coalesce with those regulatory and management changes that are under the purview of the Council that all can affect community outcomes like jobs and livelihoods, their participation and engagement in fisheries, their overall social and cultural well-being, as well as affect their future ability to respond and adapt to other stressors and changes, including management changes. So as Gilly mentioned, the overall goal of the project is to try to provide this tool, this decision support framework, to improve the Council's ability to understand how their decisions, how management actions affect fishing community resilience, or the ability to withstand, recover from, and adapt to disturbances. And the key components of this project are to develop a conceptual framework to better understand what makes fishing communities more or less resilient in the face of management changes. And then associated with these attributes of resilience, as we're calling them, we want to identify some measurable indicators that are relevant to decision-making and available in the context of West Coast fisheries decision-making. And then lastly, we also want to make sure that this is a framework that is responsive and adaptive to all different types of management decisions and applicable to all different types of West Coast fishing communities. So at this point, I think it's helpful to go into a little bit more detail about what we mean by resilience. As I mentioned, I think briefly before, we're defining resilience as the ability of a fishing community to withstand, recover from, and adapt to disturbances. But in this particular project, we're really focused on management actions and regulatory changes as the key disturbance. But this disturbance occurs in the context of other disturbances, both in the past, present, and future. And we're also really interested about thinking about the resilience of fishing communities within the statutory mandates of the Council's work. And so, of course, what is really important for assessing impacts on fishing communities is National Standard 8 under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which specifies that the key goals for fishing communities are to provide for sustained fishery participation, as well as minimizing adverse economic impacts. And then related to that, that's also key to our definition of fishing communities, which are in the MSA is defined as place-based and as well as being substantially engaged in or dependent on fisheries. So our main deliverables for the project are principally the community resilience evaluation methodology, which is what you've received a draft of to review for this meeting. This is based on a synthesis of literature, available tools, and other information that might be available on the West Coast that can inform this project and inform this work. And from that synthesis, we've not only provided the synthesis and gap analysis report for your review, but we've used that information to develop the draft methodology, which proposes a set of attributes and indicators for assessing resilience of West Coast fishing communities. The next steps, which will be coming in the coming year, are to develop the management evaluation framework, or simply just framework. And this is where we'll connect the dots between the methodology and putting this in practice. So how can we use the methodology to better understand the impacts of fishery management decisions on communities? And we expect this to be a combination of what we say is a narrative approach, which really is more of guidance and a conceptual framework of what might be important to consider, how you can interpret these attributes of resilience, and what you might want to consider when analysts are constructing their analyses for assessing impacts of fishery management decisions. We also expect this to have some analytical components, or providing some consistent, replicable indicators and metrics that can be provided in impact analyses so that these can be comparable across actions and provide consistent information to analysts and decision makers alike. Lastly, our last deliverable is a case study of a council action. This is where we'll put all of this into action to explore how it'll look in practice on a council action. This will also involve conducting a baseline assessment of West Coast fishing community resilience. So putting this all together, what we're really expecting this tool to look like is taking a variety of social and economic and fishery data that we have available on the West Coast, combining this with information about council management actions, either past and present under consideration, such as management alternatives, as well as other information about external conditions and shocks. We then will apply the methodology, which means looking at different resilience attributes and possible indicators and metrics that map to those attributes, and identifying appropriate analytical approaches. The framework then provides guidance on how to conduct impact assessments, including how to identify vulnerable fishing communities, as well as identifying trade-offs across management actions. We expect that all of this will feed into decision-making processes in similar ways as current impact analyses do. So other economic and social community information will go directly into NEPA documents or evaluations of impacts under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and be provided through the advisory bodies into the council in the typical processes that those other analyses do. We also want to note that the vision for this is that it'll be more of a living document and a living tool that can allow for updates and changes over time, that we expect that there will be new information and new indicators that can be incorporated into the tool. We want to leave room for that, and we also want to leave room for advancements and thinking about what matters for resilience, since this is such a novel topic. In terms of our timeline, we're almost halfway through the project, at least in terms of time. We kicked off this work in spring of 2025, and we've been spending much of the last year working on our synthesis and gap analysis document, as well as working on the draft methodology that's in front of you today. This council meeting and the June meetings that we're having leading up to it are to review the draft methodology and to provide feedback on it, as well as identify options for a case study. We then will take your recommendations and feedback and incorporate it into the draft methodology, and also use that to develop the draft decision framework. We'll then spend the next year working on the decision support framework, conducting the baseline assessment, as well as making any changes as we find them in accordance with the findings of the case study. We then will come back to you all next June with some draft findings before we finalize everything before September of 2027. So today we're going to focus on going over the highlights from the synthesis and gap analysis report, and give a little bit more information about what our guiding principles were for designing the methodology. And then we're going to give a high-level overview of what the methodology is, what are some core concepts and components in the methodology, before wrapping up with a discussion about your recommendations and other feedback for us to consider as we move forward in our work. So right now I'm going to open it up for just questions about what I've just gone over in terms of what the project is about and what we're hoping to achieve before Karma's going to give more of the overview of the actual methodology and synthesis and report findings. So if there's any questions, we can take those now.
Looks like we have a question from Jessica.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for this overview. And this may not be the appropriate time to ask this question. I just wanted to go back to slide 7 and where you show the framework, and there's 3 kind of products almost underneath that schematic for resilience impact assessments, identification of vulnerable communities, and trade-offs and opportunities. And I just was wondering, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what this framework includes, and does it include multiple assessments that are then integrated into like an overarching score or ranking of community resilience, or are they multiple components that can be used to come to your own conclusion?
That's a great question. I don't think that it's that specifically determined yet. I doubt it looks like what you're saying. I think these are more components of the framework rather than distinct deliverables or things that it's going to provide. So I think that these will all be part of the framework, but I don't think that it's ordinal or that these are necessarily distinct pieces of it, if that makes sense. And certainly, since we don't have a draft framework yet, there isn't, I think, a precise answer to your question.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All right. I'm not seeing any. Are you seeing any, Gilly?
I'm not at this point. Thanks.
Okay. Well, let's continue. I'm going to hand it over to Karma at this point, and then I'll pick it up at the very end for the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. So yeah, we're going to dig into the foundations of the methodology as Melissa outlined a few slides ago. If you can advance. Okay, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the components that went into the synthesis and gap analysis report that should also be available to you through the links that Gilly provided. For the synthesis and gap analysis report, as a first step in this project, we did a literature review in terms of what was available in the investigations of resilience in West Coast communities. We also conducted interviews with a set of folks who were in the know about these issues, about West Coast fishing communities and about resilience topics. We had assembled a advisory team of 11 individuals from government, from NGOs and academia, who could help provide guidance and support as we developed some of these products and through the course of the project. And we organized quarterly meetings with that advisory team. There was also a overview of council processes to sort of figure out where this kind of work could be inserted best within the decision-making process for the council. And we surveyed existing tools, measures, and indicators that were important to West Coast, more fishing communities generally, but also West Coast communities in particular, especially when thinking about resilience. And then, of course, we reviewed existing resilience frameworks to see how those could be used and adapted for this effort. And lastly, of course, we were keeping our eye on in-progress initiatives from within the Fisheries Service and elsewhere that would help inform this work, the development of new indicators and so on. So that was part of the process up to now, but it also and went into the synthesis and gap analysis report, but it's also going to continue as we move forward. Next slide, please, Melissa. Okay, so some key findings from that effort, that report. Starting with key finding number 1, which is that the existing approaches that are out there can provide a very strong foundation for this work. So things that the council, approaches that the council is familiar with, including, for example, the community social vulnerability index measures. And you can see the figure on the right represents the most recent California Current Ecosystem Status Report with community social vulnerability measures plotted on the on the y-axis against the next bullet point, the fishing engagement and reliance measures plotted on the x-axis. So, these are existing approaches that are familiar to the council and do provide a strong foundation. There are also diversification measures, fishery diversification measures that go into the annual ecosystem status report that would be valuable here, and other metrics that are included in that report. We are, of course, tracking updates to these measures, including the social vulnerability measures. As I mentioned, that's part of our keeping our eye on in progress initiatives. So there may be some changes going forward there. Okay, so our second key finding is that most council decisions require forward-looking analyses. That is, the council, in other words, wants to evaluate impacts before they occur. But resilience frameworks are often retrospective. There's a sort of a look back to some shock or event that may have been affecting resilience or mitigated by resilience, and so we need to sort of adapt that retrospective look to a forward-looking approach. So this led us to the conclusion that a vulnerability framing could be useful here. Next slide, please, Melissa. So our third key finding is that in thinking about resilience for West Coast fishing communities, adaptive capacity in communities is very important. But it is also one part of the resilience framing that can be difficult to measure. And by adaptive capacity, we're referring to the ability to respond to and adjust to impacts to communities. There are adaptive capacity can be broken up into domains or individual components of this broad concept of adaptive capacity. And the literature suggests that some of these elements of adaptive capacity, domains of adaptive capacity, are easier to measure than others. So, for example, adaptive capacity oriented toward the flexibility in the community or the assets available to the community tend to be easier to measure. There are existing indicators. But there are other important parts of adaptive capacity that are more challenging to measure or quantify, and things like organization, learning opportunities and capacities within the community, and then community level agency. Next slide, please, Melissa. And as I mentioned earlier, in addition to our advisory team, we did interviews with community members, folks in the know, people that might help us sort of develop this work. And so on this slide, we've highlighted some key themes that came out of those interviews. The first being that when we're thinking about West Coast fishing community resilience, infrastructure is very important, obviously. But as compared to some other things we might be able to measure, information about infrastructure is not as abundant. It can be data limited. And by infrastructure, of course, we're referring to things like net repair businesses and so on, or sort of the unique dry dock infrastructure that might be available in a community like Port Orford, Oregon, that you see pictured there. But also, perhaps most importantly, the processing capacity within communities that are very important for community capacity to respond to changes and events. A second key theme that came out of these interviews was the idea that cumulative stressors matter. When we're thinking about community resilience, there is a sense that like multiple natural disasters or other shocks or events that have already occurred might in fact affect the response to or the impact of a particular new change, like a new management a measure that's being adopted. So that was something that interviewees really wanted to emphasize. And then, of course, fishing communities are diverse, and they may require sort of unique approaches that acknowledges this diversity. And I know that diversity could be about the structure of the community, kind of just in terms of its infrastructure, like Port Orford's unique port versus another community on the Oregon coast. It could be about the diversity within the communities in terms of the people who live and work there. And it could be even about the kind of fishery that gets prosecuted. So for example, the at-sea fishery for whiting is quite different from other fisheries. And the community, the labor force may be brought to a particular community for a less permanent or a shorter term position in the community versus a longer term fishing type of fishery where there are residents and folks living there for greater periods of time. So it's just it's a unique form of fishing that has that requires unique considerations. Lastly, of course, in these interviews, many of the folks suggested that additional research or data collection efforts could support a more complete view of community resilience, including some of the more complex and difficult to measure elements of community resilience that are about social structures and social capital and so on. Next slide, please, Melissa. Okay, so getting into the draft methodology that's available to you all today, there were these kind of central design principles that were important for developing that draft methodology. First being something you've already heard about, that we wanted to build from existing approaches. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel here. Also, because of the nature of this project, we wanted to prioritize a practical application of the methodology. In other words, some of the elements that go into it couldn't be overly aspirational. It had to have this practical value in a decision process for the council. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to support a forward-looking analysis and then incorporate adaptive capacity and measures of adaptive capacity where feasible. Also, throughout, we wanted to maintain flexibility to adapt to new data, find ways that we can think about those unique considerations of fisheries in thinking about resilience, and then throughout acknowledge uncertainty. Next slide, please, Melissa. Okay, so this, as I mentioned earlier, this vulnerability framing was one that we realized could be quite useful in our approach, and it breaks vulnerability apart into these kind of three major components. So we have exposure on the left, which are, reflects the stressors affecting the community, and then on the right, sensitivity, which is the sort of the sensitivity of the community to the potential proposed management action, the level of dependence on fisheries and the underlying social vulnerability of the community. And then kind of where the resilience rubber meets the road is adaptive capacity, which is the ability to change or respond to these stressors. So, take home here, assessing vulnerability enables this forward-looking evaluation of community impacts and reflects the assumption that less vulnerable fishing communities are more likely to be resilient. Next slide, please, Melissa. So, okay, in terms of that left side of the three parts of the prior slide, when we're talking about exposure, what we're really asking here are what are the stressors that might affect the community. So moving from the upper right clockwise around the image of the port there are things that are climate oriented in nature, like sea level rise or extreme weather events that might damage community infrastructure for fishing. There are alternative uses of the ocean, competing uses of the ocean. There are market disruptions, shifting trade arrangements, demand, and so on, closures and movement of stocks. And then, of course, the one that is maybe of most important to us are at the upper left, regulatory changes. This is where our focus is for thinking about fishing community resilience. So again, exposure is sort of recognizing the stressors or changes that might affect or impact the community. Next slide, please, Melissa. Secondly, in our framing on the kind of right side of the three parts you saw earlier is sensitivity. And sensitivity is about asking, how likely is the community to experience impacts? So what is the community's dependence on fisheries, and what is the community's level of sort of underlying social vulnerability? So we have some measures there for dependence on fisheries, you see on the left, that include things like the general fishing engagement levels for communities, the reliance on fishing. There are fishery participation networks that reflect the salience of a fishery that might be part of the management question. They're available in the ecosystem status report I mentioned earlier. And then there are these underlying social vulnerability measures, there's the underlying social vulnerability of the community that could be reflected by some of these measures. So for example, if there's a housing crisis in a community, then it may not be as resilient in the face of some major change, whether it's environmental or regulatory in nature. So again, sensitivity is the degree to which the community may be affected based on its dependence on fisheries and its underlying social vulnerability. Next slide, please, Melissa. And then, of course, lastly, adaptive capacity, where we're really asking how able is the community to adjust to this change. Somewhat intuitively, along the right side, if we suggest that a community has a lower adaptive capacity, then the options may be more limited for response to some stressor. The disruption from that stressor may be more prolonged, and the recovery may take longer. So there's this sense of longer disruption and deeper impacts. And then sort of looking over at the left side of this figure, if the adaptive capacity is higher, then the community may be more likely to adapt and adjust. It may maintain its functions, its fishing livelihoods and associated businesses, and there's an opportunity to perhaps recover and thrive. So the disruption may be shorter and the recovery may be stronger. That's sort of the intuitive notion of how adaptive capacity functions here. Next slide, please, Melissa. So some of the sort of really important foundational literature and prior work on adaptive capacity that informed our work breaks apart this notion of adaptive capacity into these, as I said, these broader categories or domains. And if you can start at the sort of top of the wheel here with learning, there are these 6 domains. As you move from learning through agency and organization and sociocognitive domains of adaptive capacity, these are the ones that are more difficult to measure, or for which there aren't a lot of existing indicators. But as we get into flexibility on the left side of the wheel and assets, they are more feasible in terms of constructing indicators. So this is sort of where we can draw on existing approaches in thinking about these major domains of adaptive capacity. Next slide, please, Melissa. So in terms of example indicators, if we're thinking about the exposure component of this approach, the question might be, what is affecting the community? What is the community exposed to? And some example indicators that are available to us might include the climate vulnerability assessments for a set of species and fisheries that are important on the West Coast. So this gives us some sense for how exposed the community might be to some of the changes that could be wrought by climate. And there's also information on management changes that the community may be exposed to, obviously. With the second component, sensitivity, here we're thinking about how dependent is the community, particularly on the fishery that may be the focus of a management question. So we have measures of community reliance and engagement with fisheries overall, and also with some fisheries in particular. There is also the underlying social vulnerability that might influence sensitivity. So for that piece of it, the puzzle, we have the CSVI measures, and the fishery participation networks also reflect the salience of fisheries that might be subjected to management change. Lastly, with adaptive capacity, the example question is how able is the community to adapt, and some measures that might sort of reflect an answer to that question might have to do with the level of fishery diversification and economic diversification in the community that might allow for other opportunities in the face of some major change. Next slide, please, Melissa. Okay, so the framework is part of our next phase of this effort, but in thinking about how all of this could be applied in that framework, the first step would be with regard to a particular management question, to identify the affected communities. What is the set of communities that are going to be important with regard to this proposed management change or this decision-making process? And then we would want to assess the exposure levels or the elements of exposure for that set of communities, evaluate maybe the differing sensitivities of these communities to that proposed management change, and then consider their adaptive capacity. So with sort of a mindfulness of all 3 of these, we would then compare among the alternatives that are generated within the decision process. Next slide, please, Melissa. Okay, so in terms of developing this framework going forward, there are these important challenges. Even for elements of adaptive capacity and the other things we're interested in developing and measuring, there are still some missing indicators. So earlier I mentioned the climate vulnerability assessments as a way of providing some information about community exposure. But climate vulnerability assessments have not been completed in a standardized way for every single fishery that's important on the West Coast. And so obviously, or every single species. Obviously, when you're thinking about the human side, the community side of this question, it's good to have the full suite of vulnerability assessments for the full suite of fisheries and species that are important. So for example, Dungeness crab and shrimp are still missing, but there are ways that the existing CVAs could still be used. And then, of course, there are missing indicators for those domains of adaptive capacity that I mentioned a few slides back. Things like learning and the agency capacities within the community, the social dimensions that include norms, values, et cetera. The other kind of challenge relates to confidentiality. Some of the measures that might be valuable for this kind of approach, involve data that relates to fishing businesses, confidential, fishing data. And so in the ways that we use them, and in particular the ways that we provide them or present them, would have to be sort of developed in a way that recognizes that confidentiality. So that is a challenge. The other big challenge is, there are different ways that some of these measures are developed for communities based on differing community scales. And so finding a way to bring in some of these indicators and provide them to the council that makes them commensurate despite the differing community scales is a challenge. And then, of course, the sort of walking the tightrope of maintaining flexibility with this work, with this resilience framework, but still providing something that can be consistently applied, that has some standard measures and consistency throughout the management questions. Next slide, please, Melissa. So you've seen the timeline already, but in terms of next steps, these June meetings, the June council meetings, is an opportunity to incorporate any revisions or changes in the draft methodology, to get feedback on those potential revisions. And then, as Melissa mentioned earlier, we'll develop a draft framework in the next phases, and select a case study, and then provide a baseline assessment of West Coast communities for review next June. Next slide, please, Melissa. Okay, and this is where we can take a break for questions and discussion on the piece of the presentation that I just delivered. I don't see any hands, but Gilly, if you see something I don't, let me know.
I do not at this juncture, no, but yes, if anybody does have a question, feel free to, I just saw a hand go up. Please hold while I scroll down. Dr. Lent. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Karma, for the presentation. On the folks that were interviewed, was there a sampling procedure such that you had a good span of larger, smaller vessels, shore-based, at sea, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it was not. There was no sampling procedure. It was not a formal process in that way. It was sometimes people talk about snowball sampling, but it was essentially names that were suggested to us came in part from the advisory team, but we did, I feel, capture folks from communities, folks from NGOs. There was like a diversity of people who have been kind of invested in these issues that were valuable, or had provided valuable insights, I should say. But no, it was not a formal, research process in that way.
Thank you.
Looks like there's a couple more hands.
Yeah, I think Kate, I think I saw your hand go up first.
Yeah, I was wondering, and you may have mentioned this, did you interview people from the processing side as well? People who work in the fish processing plants, folks who own those businesses, so on and so forth.
Yeah, we did cover that, although I think maybe people are getting a sense for an enormous or a larger scope of interviews than we actually did. I think the total was, I gotta look again, but back in the report, but it was definitely less than 20 or so. So it wasn't as if we could interview, line workers from processing plants and so on. That just was outside the scope of what we were able to do.
Thank you.
But definitely the processing sector, I should say, was represented in a couple of the interviews.
Tim, I think I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks for the explanations. When I was reading the methodology, the draft methodology, a question that kind of popped into my mind, and I thought I'd ask it here was, this is supposed to be forward-looking, and I didn't really see much about what this was trying to predict. I mean, you kind of, I think, danced around a little bit, but I'm just kind of wondering, what sort of predictions are you intending to try to get out of this?
Yeah, so I think that might come to some degree with the selection of the case study, with the sort of parts of the project moving forward. But the idea is that the management action might affect communities differently based on their adaptive capacity. They may be more or less resilient, and so predictions about whether communities sort of are resilient in the face of some major change would be useful for the council because they may want to build that into their decision-making process. So I guess it's sort of how well or quickly does a community recover from some shock or some stressor. That's where the forward-looking piece comes in. That's the prediction. But admittedly, it's still a little bit inchoate, kind of depending on the feedback we get as we move through this.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm seeing any other hands at this time.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and continue, and obviously there's more opportunities for questions during the discussion as well. So let's keep going. It's just a few more slides. So again, one of the main areas of feedback that we're looking for from the council at this meeting is to try to identify what type of case study we might consider. And we can conceive of a few different trade-offs associated with the choice of case study. So the type of case study that we choose could either be a specifications action or a more routine type of management change, updating harvest quotas or rebuilding plans, something along those lines. But depending on the type of action, it has different consequences for long-term consequences or short-term ones. And so that's a consideration for the type of action that we choose. A fishery management amendment would have an opportunity to explore more of those types of longer-term impacts, such as interactions with climate change and projected exposure to longer-term types of stressors. However, that this might be where this tool, this decision framework might be less often used because those could be constructed over a long period of time and can have unique analyses and analytical approaches that are employed as part of them. So that's, I think, just a trade-off there between the type of action. And then we could also look at a past action that has been already resolved from the council, which is very easy to do because we can choose anything. And this gives many more different types of options for either specifications or amendment types of actions that we can look at. It also allows us to compare what the results would look like from previous or current approaches, as well as also evaluate some of the ability of how it actually predicts impacts or was associated with the impacts that did occur under that action. And then with a current action, we could also go this way. That's something that's currently under consideration by the council. However, this would limit the options considerably, and we would have to coordinate with that action as it progresses. So it would be a little bit more, I think, of a balancing act for us to try to do that and coordinate with the other impact analysis teams as necessary to get inputs into the analysis or just as the action progresses, since we do have a very fixed timeline. But certainly a current action could be relevant to the council just to have a completely blank slate to see how this would look without sort of being biased or without sort of considering the differences in the approaches that were available at the time or relitigating a previous action. So those are the case study. And so in addition to thinking about the options for the type of case study and those sort of broad dimensions, we also are looking for general feedback or recommendations to ensure that the methodology and the eventual framework are as useful as possible for decision making. So the types of feedback that we might consider here is that if you're aware of other types of data or metrics or other indicators that we might consider that you didn't see in the methodology document that might align with the framework. This also could be your ideas about what is necessary to have this be related to in terms of other analyses that are used in impact assessment to make sure that it's consistent and compatible with those impact approaches. And then just general types of feedback on the types of output that this will provide. As I mentioned, we expect that this will have a combination of guidance, about how conceptually these topics, these ideas should be applied, as well as more consistent quantitative indicators that can be used and provided. But we want your feedback on what you think would be most useful for decision making and to support advisory body discussions and deliberations. So I think that's it. But of course, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if there's other questions that you have, or there are other areas of either the methodology or the synthesis and gap analysis report that you would like to discuss, those are also able to be talked about at this meeting as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Melissa and Karma. And yes, that is indeed the last slide. And so if anybody has any questions about this last section or more generally, feel free to dive in. I think we are officially in the Q&A/discussion part of the agenda. And also I'm going to just quickly, well, we'll leave this slide on the screen for a bit, but I'll also pop these sort of desired areas for feedback in the chat as well. So folks have it in case we leave the screen. Let's see here. Please hold while I check to see who that was. Oh, Jessica, hello.
Hi, Gilly. Thanks again. So again, my question may be premature. I understand that this is still kind of the beginning stages, but I'm just curious with thinking about applying this framework to a case study to kind of see what it looks like in practice. I'm wondering too what your thoughts are on how this framework would then be applied and integrated potentially in the future for council action. So is the goal to use a single framework to show its application in that case study, but how would you then broaden it to some of these other types of actions that may require different types of application of the framework? And again, it's still kind of a little bit of a haze to me. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around how picking one case study also gives us information for applying across multiple actions in the future.
No, that's a very reasonable and a very good question. And I think it picks up on the fact that the framework is intended to be general and will provide guidance and considerations for all different types of management actions and all different types of fisheries. So it will be fairly general in some places, I'm sure, because of that, of, does the action have long-term consequences? Is it only short-term focused? Is it a place where you really need to be thinking about, how the management action could be supporting diversification or other forms of adaptive capacity. It'll probably have some open-ended guidance that is intended to help analysts navigate those decisions about what could be used, what indicators could be used, what information might be relevant to incorporate in their analyses. Then the case study is supposed to show both the dimensions that are more like that of what information might be relevant to the specific type of management action that's explored in the case study, while also sort of bringing in more of these like repeated measures, these indicators that are broadly available, and showing how those can also be used in the analysis. So it's a combination, I think, of qualitative impact analysis as well as quantitative impact analysis, at least right now, is how I'm envisioning that that's going to look. And so the case study will be helpful to see how the framework is put in place, but it certainly won't limit what's in the case study to how the framework can be applied in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Rebecca, I see your hand, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. Thanks again for the presentation. I have a quick comment and then a suggestion on a case study, kind of a follow-up to Jessica's intervention. So just basically, my understanding is that the way this would work is for a regulatory action that has to specify a range of alternatives. As Melissa said, there'll be analyses of the impacts of each alternative on the community, along with economic impacts, impacts on target and non-target stocks, etc. When you think about resilience, it's almost like a curse because a lower impact on the community, because it has a high level of resilience, could mask the fact that adaptation, like switching to non-fishing employment, is obviously going to be second best. It's not the first choice. So I think it'd be important to take that into account. And just for a case study, this is kind of a, based on that wheel, one of your slides had a wheel about what you have to consider in terms of external stressors. I think it'd be interesting as resources allow to look across our FMPs and say, some fisheries, I would hypothesize salmon and sardines, probably have a much greater impact from external forces. As you read through our management actions on salmon and sardines, it's pretty clear that we can try our best, but if there's not enough water or the habitat is destroyed, or if we're in some natural decadal fluctuation, then those factors may be more important in terms of external stressors. It doesn't mean the resilience isn't important, but I think it's critical as the council to know what we can and cannot do. We talk about that quite a bit in looking at, for example, the Habitat and MPC committees looking at external forces. So that's a suggestion for a little bit of a off the track case study. I think it'd be helpful for the council. Thank you.
Helpful. Thank you, Dr. Lynn.
Other questions that folks may have or points of discussion, points of clarification? I think that's good.
Yep, sorry, one more. I always have questions. So my question, I think, is on this idea of types of case studies and thinking about a retrospective analysis versus a current action. And in Karma, your section of the synthesis document, you were really talking about how these vulnerability type assessments are really primed for forward looking. And so I'm just curious on if that is the intent of using like a vulnerability style assessment, the utility of then for a case study looking at a retrospective analysis.
I can answer this, Karma, and then you can chime in. I think if I understand correctly, yeah, there is some tension there. Like if we're looking in retrospect, are we really evaluating the ability of it to be forward looking? I think that's what you're asking, right? Or are we sort of missing the mark? Yeah, exactly. And I think that is kind of a consideration, but it's also not. Like I think we would proceed with the case study as if it is forward looking, what you would say about it. But we obviously do know some more about the future. We just wouldn't take into to account those future features. We wouldn't conduct the analysis, a typical like retrospective analysis for resilience. You would know exactly sort of like what the difference in the state was between the pre-shock and the post-shock, and you would incorporate that into the analysis. So we wouldn't do that. We would still only construct the analysis over what the fishing community looked like before the management change. You know, what was its pre-shock vulnerability and other parts of it, and what does that say about what we expected the impacts were. The only sort of difference in and it is a little bit, I think, what the SSC and others were talking about is that does then give us the ability to try to validate it by then looking at what actually did happen. But that I think that's the what you're talking about is sort of like, can we really separate those two things and still kind of be clear about it, looking at it in a forward-looking manner? And feel free to follow
Yeah,
up.
I don't have much to add, but that's a good question. Thank you. That's good. Yeah, there's like a sort of a hindcasting, I guess, opportunity with that retrospective, but we ultimately have to keep our eye on the sort of forward-looking a ball, so to speak.
Great, thanks.
Great. Louis, go ahead.
Thank you, Gilly. I'm particularly interested in this, being a former council member, and very glad that Rebecca is on this, and she has the ability and experience to focus on economic impacts. One of the biggest things we wrestle with, and did wrestle, I wrestled with a council member and concur now as a GAP member, is the definition of risk, or trying to figure out what risk levels can be tolerated. And this is usually focused on risk to the stock. I think that we do not look enough at risk to the community of our decisions about a stock. We're currently looking at reducing some trip limits, and where is the point that we can reduce a trip limit and not actually radically impact a fishery? Where is the point that we can the fishery can still exist and profit, and we don't have this point where suddenly there's a trip point where the fishery just collapses because of lack of markets, or, as Rebecca pointed out, people going to other means of work. This is particularly important in San Diego, where there are other opportunities to earn a living, but people would prefer to be doing it fishing. But when it gets to a point where they can't make a profit anymore, especially with raising costs that we're facing now, there's a tripping point. And I don't know if we look enough at this, at the risk of reaching that trip point. Thank you.
Yes, I think those are wonderful points. And I would love to hear from others on the call too, if they have similar experiences or things that they typically wrestle with in their decision making. That feedback is really helpful for us at this juncture of the project. But I think quickly into response, I think you're exactly in line with where we are thinking about this. And we did talk about this in the synthesis report in particular, that these tipping points, those inflection points, are really tricky, I think, with the current state of knowledge and what we know about and the data that we have about fishing communities and fisheries, to be able to predict exactly where those points are. But that is in part why we are proposing to use a set of indicators that can help navigate that to some extent, you know, to see what the economic dependency of the community is on a particular fishery, how important a particular fishery is to accessing other fisheries or for their overall business stability at sort of the individual and the community level. At the processor level, also thinking about how much it contributes to processors and their sort of stability through time and generally. Those are kind of the ways that we're trying to tease out those things. It's not perfect, but I think that's sort of where we are with the available indicators and knowledge at this time for trying to provide some of those indicators of risk, or what those tipping points could be.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. You can imagine like a community being sort of resilient as a place. In other words, the place still exists. There's still people still have jobs, but as you highlighted, I think it was Louis, that at some point, if they're not fishing anymore, if they move on to other work, then it's not a fishing community, so to speak. And so that is, and I think Dr. Lent also highlighted this point, like you use sort of other economic opportunities to maybe fill the gap when the fishing livelihoods aren't available, and then you return to them, but it can maybe mask some things. But the idea here is that in the context of NS8 and sort of council processes, the resilience is of fishing communities as fishing communities, not just as places that are doing well. I don't know if that's useful, but that's where my thinking went from this discussion.
That's a very good point, Karma.
Thanks for that. And thanks, Louis. Just not seeing any hands at the moment, but we'll just give it a moment for things to marinate, percolate. The floor is wide open.
And again, I'll just make a plug that, similar to Louis' comment, that if there are rocks or there are things that come to mind about gaps in current analyses to really get at these concepts, or information that you don't feel like has been available but wish was available, I think that that's all fair game for discussion right now, and we would love to hear that type of feedback.
Not seeing any hands at the moment, but what I was wondering, what we could do, and then we're a little ahead of schedule, is we could pivot to our public comment period now, and then we can always return to the to open discussion with advisory body members in the event that other questions or comments bubble up between now and then, as long as that works okay for folks. So with that, and we can also come back to the public comment period since it's agendized for a little later in the meeting, but at this point, we would love to open things up for public comment. Oh, I see a hand. Corey Ridings, hello.
Hi, Gilly. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Karma. My question, I actually have a question, not a comment. It's back on slide 20, and you were talking about exposures, and I was wondering if you had thought at all about the inclusion of, I guess, what I'll just shorthand as social exposures. So exposures that are not environmental, exposures that are not necessarily economic, but exposures that are impacting fishing communities and impacting fishermen and industry members. So I'm thinking about things, and I was just jotting these down, but things like how cell phones and internet connectivity have really changed how people fish, and how people might view themselves as wanting to go fishing or be fishermen or enter or leave the occupation. Similar things like, I'm not sure how something like COVID fits into how you're thinking about this. COVID to me, while it is sort of an environmental thing, it's a biological thing, it really impacted society in a very extreme social ways, and those had major impacts on fishing. Also things like changing diets, for example, how people, and this is very place-based, but how people think about their diets and how they prioritize and think about fish or protein. And then also I was thinking, as this conversation was just unfolding, about identity and preference to be fishing over other occupations, even if the like sort of economics or the money lines up to do something else, there's clearly preference to be going fishing. So things, and how would you measure that? So I think of things like occupational prestige or how personal identity is wrapped up in that. So those are all things that are social, but they do change over time. And I think we've really seen impacts of those things. So I'm curious how this fits or doesn't fit and how you're looking at this, and if you have any thoughts on how it might.
Give a stab, but then I definitely want to hear Karma's thoughts because I'm sure Karma has many thoughts too. But I think that's a really wonderful question and point, and I think I'd love to talk with you more about this because I think that there is something there. But in my mind, it also gets a little bit muddled of like the definition of exposure and sort of like the definition of a shock. So I think you're right on line with COVID. Like that's definitely a shock. Like that's definitely something that we would expect to sort of have sort of widespread and sort of like in the moment impacts at the community level. And that sort of is the other point too, is that as you're talking, I'm sort of thinking about how these concepts do intersect and overlap with not only other parts of the framework, like more adaptive capacity types of components or underlying vulnerability types of components, but then also just like the social impact assessment part of impact evaluations generally. And so some of those types of considerations may be better considered at the individual level and in the social impact analysis than necessarily at like the community impact analysis level, because I think that they're related but a little distinct. And not to say that like it isn't relevant or it couldn't be relevant, but I think we're trying to be really mindful about keeping things in the right place and not trying to make this like too far-ranging and wieldy. But yeah, very curious to hear what Karma thinks too.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I think my view is that this framework could ultimately include a set of sort of areas of information, like assets and flexibility, for example, as part of the adaptive capacity piece, that can be mapped to indicators and quantifiable elements, but then a lot of information about other parts of community well-being that are more social in nature, but we just, as you said yourself, Corey, they're harder to measure or track, but are important. So in other words, that could be part of a narrative. If we develop a framework that has a more narrative piece, that it would include all of that kind of information for the council to sort of take up in its decision-making process. In other words, it would be tagged, highlighted, identified, but not necessarily quantified because there aren't good existing indicators. So things like, as you said, fishing identity, occupational identity. There are some measures of that from some of the work being produced by the Northwest Center that we describe in our reports, but there aren't the same level of kind of annual available data as there are for other things. So, we would get into that, offer it, but not have the same kind of quantifiable information. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but I think within the adaptive capacity domain of sociocognitive elements, there were things like norms, values, the value of being a fisherman certainly would fit in there in the adaptive capacity, although you framed it as potentially part of exposure, because it might be leading people to do things that are not economically rational, so to speak. But anyway, there's space there for that, I guess, but just we make an effort to kind of distinguish between those things for which there's available information and things for which there's still a lot to be done.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks for that, everyone. I see a hand from Sherry Hafer. Feel free to go ahead, Sherry. Oh, maybe not.
Oh, there you go. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound
Okay,
great.
so I'm Sherry Hafer. I've been married to a commercial fisherman almost 40 years now. We are out of Morro Bay, and so we've been dealing with the coming of offshore wind. So I would like to add another pressure, an exposure that I think is very important, and that should be something that's more monitored and understood before they continue to do more. So they're using high energy geophysical mapping, survey mapping, 40 feet off the bottom, using AUVs that emit up to 228 decibels, and at fairly low frequencies, 2 kilohertz, which is pretty low. And then they have positioning sensory systems that go along with it. In Morro Bay, they had 79 of them that emit 206 decibels at 9.5 hertz to help direct the AUVs. So that went on from April till November. It was right over essential fishery habitat. There was no before-after control impact studies to see what are the impacts. We saw a 70% decline in our spot prawn fishery. We saw declines in our black cod fishery. We saw the fish having strange food in their mouth that they never had before. We don't know what it did to the benthic habitat, or the small creatures that are most vulnerable to that type of mapping. So before going forward, I mean, the goal of California, AB 525, is 25 gigawatts, which would be 4,500 square miles of ocean. And I think it's imperative on our people that are trying to protect the ocean to make sure this mapping isn't wiping stuff out and doing some kind of Bakke studies. There's plenty of baseline studies available that you could go off of. The bottom trawl surveys that have been done for 20 years, right in that area, you could do one inside, one side outside, before, during, after, something, because now they're just going on assumptions that it doesn't hurt anything. And I think that we deserve better than that. Thank you. That's all I got.
Wonderful points. Thank you so much, Sherry.
Just to clarify, Sherry, it was your point is essentially that it's not just offshore wind kind of development, but it's the process of mapping and thinking about the development itself.
Yes,
That's also part of-
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
The USGS is doing a lot of mapping too, and I just think we need to look at that mapping and see what how much it actually is impacting our fisheries. The USGS did what they call the Express program. It started in 2017, mapping the bottom of the ocean using AUVs. And 2018 to 2023, the spot prawn fishery went down tremendously, right over where they were doing the mapping. And I mean, it could be just coincidence, it could be other factors, but we just don't know. This needs to be closer looked at.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sherry. Just looking. Oh, I just saw a hand pop up. Oh, Merritt, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to what's counting as resilience, whether it's being able to walk through a hit, a change, without missing a step. The processing plant no longer has access to one species, but substitutes in another. Or does it count a fishery where the hit actually extinguishes some aspect of the community, say that processing plant, but it is able to quickly come back once the fishery opportunity returns? So what is resilience? What is resilience in those terms?
Yeah, that's a very good question too. And I think that's a little bit what we were getting at the very beginning, talking about National Standard 8 and sort of the definition of the ability for fishing communities to continue participating in fisheries is one criteria, as well as trying to minimize economic impacts on fishing communities. But I think you're right that, it really depends on the nature of the action that's under consideration and can be very specific to the different fishing communities. And so all of those things I think can be taken into account and should be taken into account. Especially if it aligns with the goals and objectives of the fishery management plan or of the specific action that you're looking at, trying to minimize specific types of impacts. But I think you're on the right track that it can be all of those types of things. Trying to make sure that processors can keep operating as close to normal as possible, or if it's impossible to make sure that they're operating as close to normal as possible, that they're able to quickly bounce back, and that you're not, again, as we talked about earlier, sort of going over those tipping points or turning points where you might lose the processor, or you might lose valuable infrastructure, or the fishing community would no longer exist as it currently or previously has.
Thank you, Merit. Thank you, Melissa. I see James has his hand up, and I was going to say before turning to James's question, I thought I would do one more just quick call for public comment, and then if there are no further hands on the public side, we can sort of switch back to our open conversation. So sorry for the ping pong match here, but just maybe I'll ask one more time if there's any additional members of the public that would like to say anything or ask a question. Great, I'm not seeing anything at present, but if another hand pops up, that's great. We can of course accommodate that. With that, I will say we are now moving back into open discussion with the advisory body members, and we'll turn to Mr. James Phillips.
Thanks, Gilly. I apologize if you guys already covered this and I missed it. I had some IT issues this morning. Wasn't able to jump on right away. I was wondering if you looked at fisheries communities and to kind of just quantify like which fisheries each independent community was more or less dependent on. So like some places are salmon or groundfish or HMS, those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And Karma, I don't know if you want to answer this one.
Oh yeah, James, that goes into the sensitivity piece. So if a community is, as you say, more dependent on HMS, and if the management action is about HMS, then that would be reflected in, or that's a way of measuring potential sensitivity. So absolutely.
Great. And then to build on that, did you also look at the interactions between those fisheries? Because oftentimes we look at, we have the council broken out into like, hey, these are the salmon agenda items and these are the groundfish agenda items, but the impacts to the community can sometimes stack upon themselves. For example, the salmon fishery has been closed for the last, for 3-year chunk. So that impact was already there. So any additional changes to groundfish or other fisheries has a stacking impact upon the community.
Yeah, and actually that's a theme that came up in our interview, is this idea that you sort of can't look at an important fishery in isolation. And so I think that the way we maybe get at that is through using, like, one of the proposed indicators are these participation networks that reflect the relationships between fisheries or for communities. So it's there's a measure of node strength, which is kind of the importance of that particular fishery, but then also the network reflects what other fisheries that community or vessel might be engaged with. Also, some of the fishery diversification measures might help get at what you're identifying, which is there's a relationship between multiple fisheries for individual fishermen and for whole communities.
Yeah, I apologize if you guys touched on this. It sounds like you did. Did you have thoughts on, like, I don't know, some way to like kind of quantify that or like illustrate that To just, I don't know,
Yeah.
I'm trying to some way to, how to show that,
Yeah.
like, to make it
Yeah.
abundantly obvious to people,
Yeah, so I mean, some of the existing approaches, as I mentioned, do start to quantify things that are maybe not directly measuring, I think, what you're describing, but provide useful information for thinking about the relationships between the different fisheries in a community. And there are quantitative measures for these, like strength, as I mentioned, or the association of diversification measures with like income stability.
Yeah, we hear a lot of these kind of comments in open public comment when people are talking about the council, and the fishing community will bring these up as like anecdotal information that is useful to inform council decision. But yeah, anyways.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very important point, and I think, and there are certain fisheries that form a regularly engaged in kind of trifecta, or basically like there's an important fishery, but then there are these two others that particular fisherman or community might rely on regularly to, in addition, like to tap into seasonal variation and so on, right?
Yeah, I know it's difficult process to quantify or to present in some kind of way that's useful or beneficial to decision makers. And it seems like it would be relevant and useful to present these for council managed fisheries, but then you also have like kind of interactions from potential state managed fisheries and council managed fisheries. For example, in the wintertime in like Northern California, groundfish and Dungeness crab combination trips are highly beneficial to the communities up there. So in impact to groundfish and or Dungeness crab, that either one of those things can have community impacts upon the economic viability of some of those trips. Yeah, and I don't know how you get into that state waters, kind of considerations where I'll quantify those, or if it's even appropriate in the council process. But
yeah, I wasn't being specific, but I was kind of trying to be broad and vague. But that's that kind of combo I was thinking of, the crab, groundfish, salmon combo. But anyway, thank you for that.
It's on your radar, and you guys are going to come up with the great way to fix it all. Glad to hear it. Good work.
I'm so glad we solved that conundrum. Thanks so much, James. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa and Karma, for the presentation. Was wondering, just a question more on the process and the use of the framework, and how do you envision the framework actually being used by the council? Like, who does that? Is it the management team? Is it the science center? I mean, I appreciate the proposed outputs of the framework and the narrative development, but who is actually going to do that and do the interpretation and present those results to the council for their consideration? And I guess along those lines, has there been a discussion of whether there are sufficient staff resources and capacity to do that in the council process with council staff, management teams, and science centers?
Yes, that's a very good question. And without speaking for the council, so Gilly, feel free to jump in or amend anything that I say, but it is the vision and the expectation that this methodology would be used by the analysts who currently are conducting the community impact assessments, who are currently putting together the other impact assessments for management actions. So I won't say anything. It's not something that I have explicitly discussed with council staff, but that I think that is the expectation, is that it would fit into current workloads. But Gilly, I don't know if you want to chime in about that, about any of the decision making or forward thinking about the impacts that this might have on workloads.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Michelle, for that question. Yeah, I think I would just echo what Melissa said. I think we have not, well, the council certainly hasn't had a an opportunity until this meeting to really talk in detail about this particular project and its various components. And so that that sort of implementation question, who and how will this be, will this tool be utilized, and in what stages or opportunities of council actions would this come into play? I think, maybe that'll be a topic that gets discussed a little bit while the council is considering this work next week. But I think that it probably would, the sort of best case scenario, or not best case scenario, but sort of like the goal or the idea is that it would sort of merge into work that's already underway in terms of developing analytical products and alternatives, et cetera, and being able to sort of enhance that work with this sort of new framework, this new opportunity to sort of better measure and understand impacts of council decision making on communities. So hopefully it does not add a ton of work to anybody's plate, but rather enhances the ability of the council in general to better meet its National Standard 8 responsibilities and obligations, as well as just enhancing analytical opportunities, et cetera. So anyway, I think I just said what was said, but in far too many words.
You said it much better than me, Gilly. So thank you.
No, not at all. But anyway, yes, and I think also stay tuned for sort of more nuance on that as things progress over the next several months. Thanks. Rebecca Lynch.
Thank you, and thanks for indulging me with one more thought. Michelle Conrad has inspired me to ask. The way I see this is, when you do the first case study, you would go in and look at a potential fishery action for one FMP, let's say in groundfish, and you would develop, you do a study of the resilience of each of the fishing communities that could be impacted by that measure. So you have kind of an assessment of the resilience of that fishing community. Would that not be a basis for the next time you're looking at salmon or CPS or HMS? If there's an overlap in those communities, is that set of indicators of resilience useful across FMPs? Kind of comes back to the first question I raised. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I could certainly see how the baseline assessment would help inform multiple FMPs. That once you have it, certainly would have to be updated, since it changes, the exposure to various threats and what's going on, and can even be affected by other fishery management measures. So, but yeah, within a reasonable amount of time, I certainly could see that sort of that baseline assessment being relevant across FMPs.
Thank you.
And I think there was a question in the chat. Gilly, did you see that one?
Oh, I did. Thank you. And then I navigated away from it by accident. But yes, I will go ahead and read that out if that's helpful. This is from Amanda at Oregon Sea Grant. Thank you, Amanda. Will there be consideration for fishing, occupational safety, and fatality risks in the community resilience analysis, either qualitative or quantitative?
Yes, and thank you, Amanda, for this question. I think it's a really good question, and I think in my mind it isn't something that I had considered being a part of this framework, and I think it's in part because it relates to other national standards and sort of other components of impact analysis. Again, this is sort of where the community impact assessment is relevant, and it builds off of other impact assessments that are being done for management actions, but it doesn't necessarily redo or consider all aspects of those. And so I think it's kind of an issue of scale, is the risk at the scale of the fishing community, then maybe it would come into this process. But if it's not, or if it wouldn't be expected to have some pathway, then we might not consider it. But again, Karma, please chime in if you can see an alternate pathway, because I must admit I haven't thought about that particular type of aspect for this yet.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are data on, fatalities and safety incidents in fishing, and there are some data on fishermen health, which are relative to the general population, that are interesting and useful and so on. I think what we would have to figure out is the sort of the mechanistic relationship between that safety incident fatality data and then the whole of the community in terms of its resilience, which is something that was identified with our discussion with SSC. So it's kind of figuring out those causal relationships between those things at the scale of the community that gets a little more difficult. But I think Amanda's point is, oh, you're adding to it. Sorry, I'm reading now. Yeah. Anyway, I think that there are certainly interesting data there. You're adding.
I see the follow-up. Carmen, do you want to read it aloud?
Yeah, she says, I think the potential exposure would be less about the specific fishing practices and more about the additional pressure that economic stress puts on risk tolerance and decision-making processes. Right. I know that there's been some research on, like, do, for example, catch shares reduce safety issues because there's not the pressure to go out in bad weather. I think there's been some research there. But yeah, I think this is an area, this is actually important feedback for Melissa and I to engage with, how we could bring those data into this framing. Yeah, and as Dr. Lent points out, Melissa mentioned, there are other national standard 8s that come in, or other national standards that come into play here besides National Standard 8. I don't know if you have anything to add, Melissa.
No, that you did perfect. Thank you, Karma. And thank you, Amanda, again for the question.
Yes, thanks so much. Whitney, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Melissa and Karma, for the presentation and the overview. This was helpful. Going along the lines of just asking, I guess, whether certain things are a component of all of this analysis, I'm curious if there is consideration or inclusion for generational resilience in the fishing community, and I know there's nationally and I'm sure internationally, there's a concern about younger generations having less of an interest to get in fishing. And, if we don't have people to fish, then we won't have a fishing industry. So is that part of this consideration and the long-term resilience of the industry in terms of turnover and new entrants?
Yeah, very good question. Another one that I'm eager to get Karma's feedback on as well. But I think yes, and this is one where I can see the link more clearly to community level effects. And so I think that is where it comes into play, is that where you are investigating consequences of an action that does have consequences for entry into the fishery and the ability for people to come in, or for sort of accumulation of fishing rights or something along those lines, I think absolutely you would take that into account. I think, again, it's a little bit, it's interesting to think about that type of effect specifically within this framework. And that's something that I think is a good example of something that we could think about a little bit more of. How would you interpret the sort of transferability of harvest privileges in this type of lens? Like, what does that impact in terms of adaptive capacity for the fishing community? And what are those sort of mechanistic links? So I think, yeah, very good question and good food for thought for us.
Yeah, great question. We definitely did review the graying of the fleet literature when we worked through this. And I know there are some data on age of fishermen on the West Coast. But yeah, as Melissa mentioned, it's harder to think about how to put all of this in a way that fits the framing, but definitely like food for thought going forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. Jamie, go ahead.
Thank you. I've really appreciated everybody's comments and feedback, as well as the presentation. I keep thinking like, oh, that's another good point that like we've all kind of thought of or said, but it's hard when we're all in one place, like at one point, to kind of pull all the thoughts over multiple years together. So I appreciate everybody kind of popping in with all those different points. As far as the type of case study, I really like the idea of a retrospective and coming out kind of as if you were back then, starting with that, not and running it through as if you didn't know the outcome yet, and then comparing it. So, you know, being able to really ground truth, you can take into account, you know, public testimony that was provided on that, and fishermen's warnings of, if you do this, this is what we believe will happen, or we know will happen. And then you know, things like that, seeing if that played out that way, how those actions affected the fishery, but also the fishery communities, and the cumulative effects across or within that FMP, but also across the other FMPs. To what James Phillips was saying and others have mentioned, it's not just strictly ground fish fishermen, but those regulations do have ripple effects into others, or it's people that are in multiple FMPs, fishing in multiple FMPs, and so therefore there's, you know, say the cow cod yellow eye action 25 years ago, 20 years ago, followed by a CPS, followed by an HMS action or a salmon action, you know, and so um, those cumulative effects across FMPs and within an FMP. Um, and I think that that would be really helpful to look at it from that way and be able to ground truth. You know, these were the council concerns back then. If they go through with this action, and is that what happened? Did something worse happen? Did it not happen? So I think that would be really helpful moving forward, and taking into account some of the things that Merritt and Rebecca and Louie and Corey have mentioned, and as far as, you know, fishing in your fishery, that is the goal, and having to then maybe buy all new gear to go into a different fishery, or have to go buy a bunch of equipment to start doing auto repair and cleaning or catering or construction, um, you know, and that's not what the folks I know, speaking for myself, my own family, and others, the want and desire is to stay fishing. That's part of an identity, whether it be generational, whether it be cultural, and then as far as community well-being, when fisheries start to shutter in an area, yes, there's the port infrastructure and things like that gets lost, but also the community as a whole. So families start moving. There's less kids in a school. The school system starts to struggle because of the strain. A loss of, you know, maybe spouses are teachers and they're having to leave as well. Nurses, doctors, things like that. Spouses who have other jobs within the community. That was something that I heard about when I was able to visit up in Kodiak, because it's such a concentrated community, that when there are effects, it's very real and very immediately seen. So realizing the ripple is more than just within the port area. It's the other. The larger community as well that feels those impacts, tax-based revenue, things like that. So thank you.
Yeah, all wonderful points. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think that that's all really helpful, and thank you for summarizing all the feedback so succinctly. Looks like a couple more, or maybe just one more hand. Sherry, did you have another comment or question?
Maybe not. I wonder if that was a legacy hand, potentially.
Oh, might have been.
I do not
It looks
see-
like she might have signed off, so maybe she hit the hand instead of the.
Oh,
I'm not
gotcha.
sure. Yeah.
All those buttons are very close together there at the bottom.
Yeah, I've done that myself.
As have I. So far, I'm glad I have not ended the meeting for all by accident. Um, let's see. I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment, but perhaps I will do. Oh, lovely. Who might we? Oh, Mr. Merritt McRae. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking through my notes in this, and I probably didn't pick it up, but I'm not seeing consideration of the impacts of foreign fisheries, either where there's competition in the marketplace from a cheaper product because of differences in, say, regulations or opportunities overseas, or where there is a market overseas that was once buying, say, for example, sablefish at a very high price that just suddenly evaporates for one reason or another, and how that is considered as an impact. Thank you.
Yeah, very good point. And I do think that that's somewhat captured under sort of the broad umbrella in that diagram of exposure to like market impacts, because that has been so at the front of mind for West Coast and actually national fisheries over the last few years. So yeah, absolutely, big structural changes in how markets and prices are for fisheries absolutely, I think, counts as additional stressors that we want to try to take into account.
Yes, for example, we know from the people who fish, this is a state managed fishery in California, but white sea bass, one of their biggest concerns within our commercial fishery is that the Mexican fishery will start their season before our commercial season starts, and they'll degrade the price structure in our local markets before our local fishers actually get an opportunity to sell any fish. So it's that kind of thing. And we were considering a regulation change with respect to white sea bass. And so it would expose us to the fact that perhaps the Mexican fishery doesn't have a commensurate regulation change. Say the size limit, the minimum size limit was increased in our fishery, but not in Mexico. We would have to, in order to keep the playing field somewhat level, limit the size of fish that people are able to import into California in order to, make the playing field a little bit more level in the marketplace. Those kinds of things, those are real impacts that happen to our fisheries currently, and they're the kind of thing that might happen as a result of a regulation change. For example, that white sea bass minimum size limit thing I was just mentioning. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great comment, especially toward the end where you linked it to the regulation change, because I do think like one of the sort of underlying, I don't know if it's tension is the right word, but with this kind of work is that there are all these things that can contribute to a community and a fishing community being resilient. And I think Jamie mentioned a whole suite of things earlier in her comment, but then there are only certain levers that the council obviously can engage with. So we're sort of, trying to grapple with what are all the things that can contribute to resilience, but at the same time, what is it that the council is doing or with a decision-making process or a proposed management change that would affect resilience or be allow for the bolstering resilience, if that makes sense. There's, part of this is to examine resilience and sort of manage for resilience to a greater extent. But then there are things that are sort of outside the scope of what the council can push and pull on, I guess. That's my point. So I appreciated the end where you were like, here's a particular regulation that might relate to this external pressure.
Yes, thank you for that. That's exactly the kind of consideration I was hoping for. Just thinking about those things we have little control over in the context of the things that we do.
Thanks, Merritt. I think Sherry's hand is back up. I think we have Sherry again. Sherry, go ahead. There might be a little audio glitch there. Apologies if Ring Central is being ornery. Which definitely happens from time to time. Well, maybe we can try to come back to Sherry if possible. But I'll just see if there's any other questions in the queue.
And I'll also say if Sherry can hear us, Sherry can submit an additional question or comment to us by email. I can put up the last slide just so that's up there. But yeah, reach out to either of us or both of us if you have additional questions or feedback. I think that's all very welcome if she's not able to connect and speak.
Thank you, Melissa. That's great. Really appreciate that. Yes, if folks, the contact info, it's right there on the screen, and or if you don't have a chance to jot things down but want to get in touch, feel free to send me an email or text or anything like that at any juncture. But yes, I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment. So maybe I will begin to wind things down a little bit, but I can sort of speak slowly in case there's any 11th hour hands that pop up. But yes, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Melissa and Karma so much for the great presentation and the wonderful discussion. And thanks so much to everybody on the call for being here and asking great questions and making such insightful comments. I think this conversation and similar conversations that are happening with other advisory bodies are going to be just critically important to, or already are critically important to, helping to develop this project further and putting this framework together. And I think it's going to be great. So, so yeah, definitely stay tuned for the council's discussion about this, which will be next Saturday. I think that's June 12th, 13th. And we'll be sure to, keep in touch with further developments as things come along. And I think with that, we could probably say goodbye unless there's any other closing remarks from either of our excellent speakers. Right. Great. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you,
Good weekend,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you.